First of all, Dr. Prince, I do want to apologize to you profusely for scheduling you at this unpropitious time. I mean, when we were kind of setting up the schedule in June or something like that, it never kind of hit us that that will be the day after the election. And I said, my goodness, because we would typically not be so close to the election. We we didn't schedule the one on the 3rd itself, which was yesterday, but we should have sort of at least given you a chance to decide whether you wanted to speak. But thankfully there are already 22 people here. Uh, And so that's a tribute to the quality of your scholarship and the interest that people have in your topic. But I do want to apologize for this. And this is the first time I'm meeting you formally. And I'm delighted to see somebody of your caliber has joined the staff of the university in a very important department, which is the African American Studies Department, with really great scholars. So welcome aboard, and thanks for signing up for this Brumback talk. My introduction would be pretty brief. I will just tell people that your name is Valerie Efua Sweeney Prince, and you are an associate professor of African American Studies here at Wayne. That your research centers on the complexities of home. Your writing often takes an interdisciplinary form involving history, poetry, drama, and performance in order to transform the history of Black women, to transform the history of Black women into political art. Um, you received your PhD from the University of Michigan in English language and literature, and your doctoral thesis was entitled Finding a Place of My Own, Home and the Paradox of Blues Expressiveness. And you have a first book entitled Burning Down the House, Home in African American Literature, which was published by a very prestigious press, Columbia University Press, and was recognized by academia as a university press bestseller in 2005. We have a second monograph entitled Daughters Exchange, which is a hybrid text exploring the African-American woman's encounter with the intellectual marketplace. And that book was selected as a finalist for Vanderbilt University's Issues in Critical Investigations in 2011 manuscript competition. You're the author of other papers, including Amity, which was included in the ontology, other ontology, not white, straight, male, healthy enough, being other in the academy. Another piece entitled On Metaphor, part of a collection entitled The Science of Story, The Brain on Creative Nonfiction. And then you have a play entitled Water Bearers, and a podcast entitled Presenting Evidence That God Still Loves Women and Writers. And you have numerous other creative works, including the award-winning June, which represents the interconnectedness of rape with global and historical factors. You've served well at several places, including being an associate professor of English and Black Studies and co-director of the Black Studies Allegheny College at Allegheny College. And I see that there's somebody in the audience from that university. Then you were the Avalon Professor of Humanities at Hampton University, a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodrow's Institute, and a fellow at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois's Institute. So we have in your presence a very active, very accomplished scholar. And the title of your presentation today is Washboards and Water Bearers, Laundry and the Work of Black Women. So I thank you so much, Professor Sweeney, and welcome you to the podium with applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, it is indeed an interesting day to gather. And I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, though I tried. Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay, good. It's strange in this format. You can't really get a sense of what's happening with the people who are in the audience. But I woke up in the middle of the night thinking, this laundry work is actually more relevant than I thought. Sometimes I think it seems tangential to many important things that are happening in the world, but given the clear camps that seem to have emerged and we are battling it out in terms of the election, it seemed to me really, really critical. And maybe it was not a poorly timed thing. Maybe it's exactly the day that we should be thinking about laundry, the day after this election, where we're still trying to figure out who the winner is. Because I think this is work that we all have to do in one way or the other. We all have to engage in. And it actually is a way of finding common ground. And so that, to me, hopefully, my point will become clearer by the time we finish this talk today, but it seemed really, really important. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to share this work. And thank you for the timing, because who knew how things would be today, but it does seem to me the best day to share this work. So thank you. I'm gonna try to figure out, I was trying to figure this out in a moment before I joined everyone, but I'm trying to share my screen because I created a PowerPoint, and I guess I'm doing this right. Is this what I'm trying to do? No, not.
Should be a green button that says share screen. Since you're the co-host, it should be on your taskbar.
So when it says share screen, I see that, and then it's desktop, so I just hit share. Let me see. But it's saying open in systems preferences. I'm sorry to be such a dunce here.
No, take your time. This is your talk.
So I don't, let's see, screen recording, Zoom. Oh, it's asking me that. Okay. Oh, wow. It's telling me I have to quit in order to do this. So let's not do it that way. I have great pictures I'd love to share, but maybe I won't get to share them because I don't want to have to quit in order to share the slides. So you have to, unfortunately, use your imagination as we go. But I'm going to read a little bit and maybe we can talk. The first slide I would have, if I could share my screen, it's an image of a sketch of the 19th century with a woman out her back door of her home, like throwing wastewater into a pit that's right there, like a barrel. And it's a rough sketch. And I want to share a little bit out of a manuscript that I'm working on. This is by the early 1880s, when Savannah Carter served as president of the Washerwomen Association of Atlanta, which was organized at the behest of Mrs. Askew of Rome, Atlanta, had emerged from the ashes of the Civil War as one of the South's most formidable cities. Yet Atlantans had an uneasy relationship with water. On a morning following a heavy summer storm, the ground around an outhouse in Atlanta might be a moat. Solid waste and sludge poured into the rank gutters. Gutters stayed in such a state, not just in residential neighborhoods. In 1881, a well-dressed businessman could not cross even the downtown business district without hiring a Black man for 15 cents to carry him over the muck that made streets into dark channels. If it was early, though, the gutter might still be flowing with fresh water. The slush could be caught up in the stream and begin its determined flow downhill. Water was always running downhill. The next slide that I would have shared with you is an image, a sketch, a drawing, another drawing of night soil men, and they would carry barrels of waste that they collected from various outhouses around the city. And you can imagine what that would look like and smell like. When it was dry, night soil men cleared sludge from the privies and outhouses in the city's wealthier families, which they sold as fertilizer to farmers outside city limits. The stench announced their coming. Atlanta relied on night soil men as part of a scavenger workforce for sanitizing the streets of human waste and horse manure. It was a haphazard and inadequate effort. Whenever it rained heavily, as it did on many days, sky smells overwhelmed the stench of the waste.
Dr. Sweeney, just a second.
Yes.
One of the members of the audience suggested that if you were to send your slides by email to Kennedy,
Yes,
you can share them, share her screen because she's a co-host, so that would help.
Let's do that. Okay, Kennedy, I'm going to do that right now. I'm sorry, I can do it pretty quickly.
I'll let you know when I have it.
Okay. All right, I sent it. I don't know.
Okay, 1 second. It looks like got your slides. Just gonna download it and then I'll share my screen real quick.
Okay. Well, while you're doing that, I'll just keep. Okay. Night soil men did not work when it rained. Instead, rain cleansed the hilltops. Outhouses and privies from wealthier families' homes often overflowed, and rainwater washed waste downhill. And when you get it open, it'll be slide 3.
Okay.
Dr. W.T. Goldsmith maintained that, quote, rainfall has in the past been Atlanta's great and merciful scavenger. Apparently, mercy belongs to those who live on the top of the hill. So if rain is the merciful scavenger that plays the role of the night soil men, what it's doing, of course, is washing the waste downhill. Like many in the 1870s, Dr. Goldsmith saw sewers as an abomination, Rainwater waste carried waste along open gutters through residential streets into city sinks. Sinks were low-lying areas like Buttermilk Bottom, Happy Hollow, Castleberry's Hill, Campbell's Block, and Summerhill. According to Bartow Elmore, who studied hydrology and residential segregation in Atlanta from the vantage of the 21st century, he writes, "To understand residential segregation in Atlanta, historians must overlay topographical and hydrological data over the two-dimensional maps of the past to see the city as people at the time would have seen it. Topography and hydrology played a significant role in shaping the geography of segregated residential development. Black people, including the vast majority of the washerwomen, lived nearest the streams and rivers, below the ridgeline, often on the same street as white people. The dwelling places inhabited by the city's Black people were determined by the flow of water." If you could go to the next slide, please. Atlanta's relative distance from a major waterway marks it as a distinctly modern city. Atlanta has no navigable waterways, no port, no real water power. The location for Atlanta was chosen because of several navigable ridges that made excellent sites for railroad lines. Thompson was the man who drove a stake into the ground to mark Mile Zero, which was the end of the Western and Atlantic railway lines in 1837. By 1854, trains were arriving on this spot from all directions. Thus, Atlanta emerged as a transportation hub for the young railway system. The next slide, please. It was confounding from the perspective of rich white people why the coloreds preferred to slum together in low places like the Buttermilk Bottom, Happy Hollow, and those other places I named. And it seemed to show the impoverishment of their minds. These places were characterized by disease, crime, and filth. They were urban sinks. A sink is a lowland place in a geological system where sediment material deposits after being routed by water from its source in highlands. Over time, these sediment routes can become geology, operating as a kind of history, selectively recording events into a natural narrative. The narrative most educated people of the day believed was that the conditions in the bottoms were the inevitable result of its depraved residents. They saw nature operating in people, but not people operating in nature. The next one, please. Likewise, the architects, engineers, and planners thought of themselves as outside of nature. They saw nature as a wilderness in need of containment and therefore apart from the city. They were fairly certain that through their ingenuity, they had risen above nature, a mindset which left them and their city unbalanced. In fact, after the Civil War leveled Atlanta and destroyed 2/3 of the tree canopy in downtown, they had rushed in to construct a new South. They built buildings, grand residences, and offices for commerce and trade, but they did not think to restore the trees. Sir George Campbell from England, traveling in Atlanta during the 1870s, described it as, quote, "a new brick-built town with no trees in the streets, but abundant mud. A city should not be built without trees." Eventually, they missed the relief that the tree canopies offered from the heat of the day. So people began calling for trees to be planted. One headline in the Atlanta Constitution from May 1870 read, "Atlanta needs shade trees." The next slide, please. But if they better understood themselves as part of nature rather than its master, they might have shown more appreciation for what goes on underground. The soil supplies the tree crown with water and nutrients drawn directly by the roots. The commonly held belief is that the roots mirror branches beneath the soil. That's not true. Instead, most trees grow within 2 feet of the surface. Roots grow within 2 feet of the surface, and they often reach farther than the height of the tree. Because tree roots are so shallow, they cannot drink from underground aquifers. Large lateral roots anchor the tree, while non-woody roots absorb moisture from the ground. In short, trees would have helped to reduce the amount of mud in Atlanta. Another reason urban engineers imagined themselves above nature is because they had developed so many tools to direct it. They had turned intersecting mountain ridgelines into a city. The city was growing. There had been fewer than 10,000 residents in 1860. Just 10 years later, Atlanta had grown to nearly 22,000 people. By 1900, the population would swell to 90,000. With that growth came an increasing demand for water. In the early days of the city, residents carried water for drinking, cooking, and washing from streams in buckets, or they collected water in rain barrels. Those who could afford it built cisterns or used pitcher pumps to draw water from the ground. But a thirsty city is not easily quenched. The next slide, please. The city needed improved water access if it was going to sustain growth. Initially, city planners justified the need for shared waterworks primarily as a means of putting out fires, which is to say an ample supply of water was necessary to protect the things that they built. Fire was a problem. People remembered the trauma that occurred on November 15, 1864, under the direction of General Sherman, when they burnt Atlanta City Hall, a few churches. They burnt everything but Atlanta City Hall, a few churches and private residences. All of it was burned to the ground. And even after that, according to Mayor Anthony Murphy's October 1866 report, Atlanta's 3 shared 5 by 5 foot wells offered only slight improvement over the bucket brigade in providing protection from fire. Each day, the horses and mules drank the city wells nearly dry. Fire insurance cost a fortune. The next slide, please. Atlanta's first dam was completed in March 1875. The dam was said to testify to the fidelity and skill of the contractors, J.T. and W.D. Grant. It stood 51 feet tall and 350 feet long and was constructed by 109 convicts. Don't worry. According to a contemporary source, every one of the inmates was well clothed, appeared whole and hearty, and was certainly vigorous. They evidently had plenty to eat and were not overworked. Note the irony, please. Likewise, Honeycutt and Bellingraph employed 120 hands to lay the pipe. There had been many starts and stops, but finally on September 11, 1875, coal fires drove steam-powered high-pressure pumps to pull water from the South River into Atlanta. This enabled the water commissioner to build 4 cisterns in the heart of the young city. The next slide, please. With a new reservoir and functioning water hydrants, water no longer seemed scarce. In fact, water became so plentiful that folks started putting their toilets indoors. Water seemed convenient. The trouble was that the wealthy operated as if gravity was irrelevant and insignificant, all while squatting at the top of nearly every hill. They pumped water into their homes and businesses and drained it out again by pipes, which ran to the edge of their property, where it poured onto the ground. Clear evidence that their consciousness was split by the refusal to reconcile their experience of living in the world with their ego. They literally washed the shit downhill while denying responsibility for the shit accumulating at the bottom of the hill. In a book titled Thirsty City, Politics, Greed, and the Making of Atlanta's Water Crisis, published by Skye Borden in 2014, she explains, throughout the entire waterworks planning process, it apparently never occurred to the Waterworks Commission that the water pumped into the city might eventually need to be pumped out again. In urban centers, streets act as rivers, moving sand, mud, and pebbles that erode, for instance, from the top of Piedmont Avenue to the bottom of Summer Hill, which is where they made the Black people live. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, it seemed that the washerwomen could not be relied on to uphold their role in the New South. Along with the New South, apparently came this new kind of Negro. The new Negro was uppity and didn't seem to know where she fit in society. And as such, she had to be taken down a notch or two. Newspaper articles published in response to the 1881 Atlanta washerwomen's strike advocated for new steam laundry. I'm not sure if I've mentioned the washerwomen's strike yet. I've been more focused on the geology and how water runs the city. So let me just back up a bit and say that in 1881, 3,000 washerwomen went on strike. It was occurring at the time just before the city was planning to host the World Fair. And so they thought it was a good moment to leverage the city's need for their services in order to increase their wages. So the newspapers of the day published articles in response to the 1881 Atlanta washerwomen's strike and advocating for this new steam laundry. And chief among the justifications for power laundries was the concern for managing the potential for disease and contagion represented by unsanitary washing practices. The articles implied that these washerwomen were ill, and if not properly handled, would compromise the well-being of the general population. For a variety of reasons, domestic servants had been blamed for carrying diseases, across the color line since emancipation unleashed the quote-unquote Negro problem on the South. Untethered from the ameliorating effects of antebellum plantation life, African Americans succumbed to illnesses from which it was claimed they had not suffered previously. Under this logic, slavery had been good for the health of those enslaved. At least that was the prevailing notion circulated by the science of the day. Medical writings bolstered false correlations between poor health and racial inferiority. As Tara Hunter would note in her study of Southern Black women after the Civil War, quote, physicians were neither neutral observers nor objective practitioners of infallible scientific methods. Though they often acknowledged the lack of dependable quantitative data to substantiate their claims, they openly relied on childhood memories and secondhand testimony from unnamed sources to support far-reaching speculations about race. End quote. The medical establishment claimed that diseases such as diphtheria, smallpox, syphilis, and tuberculosis were rampant among the Black population because Black people were more susceptible to disease. For some time, the people who lived on hilltops on the hilltops of Atlanta insisted that the filth and disease was endemic to the Black community. Washerwomen bore the brunt of these claims and were thought to spread tuberculosis by infecting the laundry that came into their homes. So laundrymen seized upon these myths and created ads like this one that you see here, made by Shepherd Laundries, that pictured an image of an African-American woman in a headscarf bent over a tub of laundry beside large lettering that commanded, "Avoid this needless risk." Ads like these proliferated because they aligned with the prevailing sentiment of white racial superiority. The redundancy of false claims across multiple platforms, including the mainstream science of its day, make the lie of racism seem true. In turn, Black people adopted respectability politics in an effort to combat these inflammatory ideas. In the years following the Civil War, African Americans sought to dispel these notions. Industrial and normal schools were built across the South to train African Americans as the embodiment of the sanitized, content, and competent domestic servant. This was part of the African American long-scale approach to upward mobility and self-reliance. It sinks neatly within a white supremacist framework by encouraging Black adherence to Christian codes, which might have been obliterated if African Americans remained more firmly connected to nature. So I think we can, Kennedy, can you help me go back from out of the slides? Okay, thank you. Yes,
You're welcome.
So that's what I wanted to share today, a piece of what I'm working on now and looking at the ways that water, laundry is water work. So in order to understand laundry and what was happening, we have to understand water and what happens with water. And once we start to do that, we start to begin to find ways to have a more complete picture of why certain racialized things happen. And so I want to stop now. I've like done all this talking, but I wanted to stop doing so much talking and like open the floor, so to speak, if people wanted to engage and we could have more of a dialogue than me just reading and talking, if that's okay. So I don't know exactly how we can facilitate that, Kennedy.
Yeah, so if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand or unmute your mic and state whatever question you have. If you don't feel comfortable talking, you can always put your question in the chat box. So whoever would like to go first, feel free, unmute your mic or raise your hand physically, or there is a raise your hand button in Zoom.
Professor Sweeney, you started your talk by saying that this might be a perfect moment for you to share this story about washerwomen and laundry. But I'm wondering if you would like to spend a minute or two just sort of fleshing that out and making that connection a little bit more explicit.
Sure. Yeah. So when I woke up, as many of us may have had a fitful night last night, I woke up and turned on the TV for a minute to see where we were with things. And then I turned it off, but it occurred to me, what came to mind was Michelle Obama's most often quoted expression, when they go low, we go high.
Yes.
And there is embedded in that a sense of righteousness and morality that makes it appealing to a whole lot of people. People think, they kind of puff their chest up and they're like, yes, we'll do that. And I think that's deeply connected to the response of, let's say, a 19th century washerwoman being called dirty. And then what do? We create entire schools. I'm a graduate of Hampton University. When it was formulated as one of those industrial and normal schools that trained young girls to be very good domestic servants. The point was to show through your work ethic and through your cleanliness just how upright a servant you could be. And the sense of righteousness and morality that we have carried into the 21st century is good for what it's good for. But my estimation is that it does not help us find the connections between human beings that is necessary in the world that we are occupying today. And so the sense of morality and sense of righteousness that is alluring to many people is just as off-putting to other people. What's different about studying laundry is that there is a practicality and a science that removes us from any need for a sense of righteousness. I mean, Barack Obama has such an appeal in part because he was like the perfect Negro. He did not do anything wrong. And so we could admire this couple. He married Michelle, and she's from South Side of Chicago, and we can admire and love, and they're beautiful, and they're tall, and they're all these wonderful things. But most of us will never be anything like that. I mean, I did not go to Harvard and whatever that law review, I can't even think of what it is. The law review, he was the first, or whatever he was the first. He was the first perfect Negro, and he was so symbolically significant. And most of us, none of us will ever reach. We can't be that, but we can admire that. And yet that image is really problematic, because following that, I don't think you can think about a Barack Obama presidency without thinking about a Donald Trump presidency. The two of them are two sides of the same coin. We're living in the same moment, which I think is marked by an election that's as close as the one we have seen, that pulls people out of the woodwork to vote, but we vote in these very entrenched ways. And so I think that the answer to the way to find common ground is to find those things that we must do that are really not about culture. Like laundry is in a certain way about culture, but it is also about water. And if I assign myself the top of the hill and I suggest that rain is a merciful scavenger because the rain washes my mess down the hill to where I make other people live, that practical reality falls apart, because when I dig the well and divert the water from the South River, that stuff is running into the water that we all have to drink. And so nature breaks down. Nature itself handles the business that it's very difficult for us to handle if we're talking about less pragmatic cultural concerns. So that's, I don't know, that's a really complicated way of answering your question, Professor Edwards, but I hope that that helped.
Very helpful, yes.
Is there someone else? I think I saw Jerry, you had unmuted your mic for a moment. Did you have something you were trying to ask or say?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming today. And it was well worth a couple minute wait to get the visuals there. You said that they made the city and kind of forgot about the trees. Was there ever any time where they rectified that, where they had a project where they actually planted trees in Atlanta, or is that kind of still the way it is there?
Yeah, they began to plant more trees, but it was more of it because there was so much mud. And that's one of the things that characterized the city after the Civil War. Once the trees, well, I mean, initially, when they started to build Atlanta, like in many places, the first thing they do is they see the forest as lumber, which is about profit, of course, and they began to cut down, and then there are results to that. They think they can farm, but then they find out it's too hilly, it's too steep. You can't really farm in the same way that you might in other parts of the country. And so they began to build industries in other ways. So it becomes a transportation hub. That's where what becomes vital there. And then there's the coal that has to move across the country. And because you can go in all four directions, that's what Atlanta is valuable for. And so that's why it also becomes an object in the Civil War, where the North needs to handle or manage the resources of Atlanta because of its ability to move people and goods. And so they burn it. And then the South begins to rebuild. They want to reclaim their identity as not just an agrarian, but an industrial place. They want to build some Northern style factories. And so in this notion of the New South, which is where the washerwomen during their time in around 1881, with the World Trade, the World Fair coming to the city, there's all of this stuff going on. So at that time, they're trying to brand themselves, but the mud is an issue. So they do figure out that the trees will help with that. So they start, I don't think there's like, I'm not familiar with any like program that they put in place, but the newspapers began to ask, they began to call for, they're like, plant trees in a more haphazard way. But yes, they start to figure out, we got to get some trees here.
Dr. Sweeney, there's a question here from Gabe. She says that I truly associate many of your points with my background in Brazil, in the civilization and urbanization process of my city in the southeast part of Brazil during the 1900s. Afro-Brazilians were prevented to access basic needs, such as housing and water service. Also, they were associated with the spread of diseases that faced the city. Do you believe that this mentality still prevents Blacks to access some basic rights today?
Yes. The simple answer to that is yes, I think so. But again, that's why I think it's important to think about So my training is in English. I have 3 degrees in English, and I'm in the humanities as a that's where my area is. But there's a thing that we have to really consider when I'm thinking about literature. Literature is produced within an industry, and industries are not without their own biases. And so that's part of why I stray and I read laundry like I might read a piece of literature, because it gives me an object that's in some ways removed from the filters that are and the gatekeepers that are embedded in the actual publication of a novel per se, or a poem. And so once we start looking at something like that, we can begin to unpack those very pieces that hinder access to resources. So yes, the work that I'm doing, I start in the 19th century. It's 3 parts. I start in the 19th century. The second part is in the 20th century, where I'm looking at West Virginia and coal country. And then the 21st century, I'm looking at Michigan and Flint in 2014. So yes, I think exactly, yeah, we are still grappling with many of the same kinds of issues. I don't know if anyone else had a question or comment.
There is, I mean, a question that seems to bubble up in my mind that's not quite formed, and you might be able to kind of contextualize it and answer it. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, it attacked African Americans, particularly in Detroit, in that area, more than anywhere else. And more often than not, African Americans or working class African Americans live in the poorer places. And there is a kind of idea, not articulated very clearly, and of course can't be articulated overtly, but it might be that, well, gee, because of the accessibility to disease of people living in these kinds of areas, then in a way they're succumbing to COVID-19 is, if not their fault, but at least partly as a result of their living in such circumstances. Does that kind of, do you think that there's any kind of connection there?
Yes, I mean, I think that's exactly why I wanted to see, like, where's the water, right? If these women are doing water work, I start with that question: how do they get the water? You know, where's the water coming from? And then when you look at the water, you understand so much about why the stereotypes seem to work, right? There are all these conditions that are set up by the way that the society itself is organized and physically engineered. And it's a failure of the engineers to understand some or appreciate, not to understand, because everybody knows water runs downhill. And it's ridiculous to imagine that because something is running downhill, it's been handled. It's a ridiculous notion. I mean, that defies, grown people understand that there are consequences, and you have to do something else in your mind to imagine. Again, I'll keep going back to that quotation from that doctor who says, rain is our merciful scavenger. It's like pushing that off to the side. And the only way that we can accomplish that is by failing to reconcile some really basic principles. And I think that's where we where we see, that's what we see happening in our 2020 world when we're dealing with a pandemic. There are some really basic principles that are not being reconciled. And it's just that those who have access to the luxury of space and distance, they are able to remain healthier because of the nature of a virus, right? A virus is seeking a host to move among. And given the physical distance that people, I live in a home that if my young adult children come in and out of with a virus, I have actually enough space where I don't have to necessarily get the virus from them, because I can get away from them and open a window and get fresh air, and all of these things happen. And it may appear that I am just being healthier or have a healthier constitution, when really I just have more physical space. And our conditions, the way we live and occupy the world, it's not accidental, it's not haphazard, it is engineered, it is designed. And so the fact that African Americans suffer disproportionately under a pandemic is part and parcel of race and racism in the country. It's just evidence. Like when we looked at 2005, the results of a hurricane, people will say it's a natural disaster that makes New Orleans, the Katrina situation in New Orleans come about, but it's not really a natural disaster. So it is a natural disaster, but there is also engineering that determines who will receive, the likelihood of who gets the most negative impact of that natural disaster. And I think that's what we see pretty clearly played out in 2020 with the pandemic. Okay, your mic.
Any other question? I mean, I've got several questions, but I don't want it to be a kind of a sort of dialogue between us. I can use the questions that I have as an excuse to contact you, since this is the first time I'm meeting you, and I'm so pleased to see you on campus, so I can hold those questions for that interaction, and hope that you will find it possible at next academic year to sign up for the series, and then we will put you in a more propitious place and time. So anybody else would like to ask a question? Or is there something else, Dr. Sweeney, that you just remembered and thought that, well, gee, I didn't get to mention that, maybe, if not, then we'll just let you go.
Well, I do want to say thank you, because it is always, you work and it seems like a vacuum. Sometimes you're just alone with your computer and your books, and it's always wonderful to be able to come out of that hole and share your thinking and to get feedback from other people who are also in the world and thinking. And so I just appreciate this opportunity very much.
Yes.
Yeah, and before you go, I think on the behalf of the Humanities Center, we thank you for participating in our Brown Bag series. I think talks like this are the reason why we do what we do. Being able to have you come on and facilitate some meaningful discussion means the world to us. And on this new format of Zoom, we wish we could have done it in person, but we're learning and we're adapting. And I appreciate everyone attending and being patient with us. And again, on the behalf of the Humanities Center, and as a small token of our gratitude, we do have a couple gifts for you. We have a journal, and usually we give gifts to all of our Brown Bag speakers in person. We have a mask with our logo and a journal, And we'll be connecting with you later in the semester to get this to you in the safest way possible. But again, thank you so much for sharing with us your work. And we're excited to be a small piece of that and be able to facilitate and host you. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I'm going to let everyone go. Thank you for coming, and everyone have a good one and be safe.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome, of course. All right.